podcast. We've been off for a week for the Eid holidays, and it's sort of back to business today. I myself have just returned from Madrid this morning. I landed in Dubai at about 1 or 2 a.m. And I was there with my daughter on a college tour, but I mentioned that as a setup for today's conversation because it seemed to me that there was so many different realities that I experienced in that just a few days in Madrid. I would go to my hotel room and turn on Bloomberg or CNN, and it was the end of the world. War, Ukraine, the traumas of it all. Bloomberg, the markets are crashing. There's stagnation. It's another week, the interest rates are going up and so forth. Then you go outside to the restaurants, they're full. Went to the tennis championship. There's people drinking champagne. These multiple realities. Perhaps we can start with Mike Muller, head of Vitol in Asia, to give us the front end of the market reality of which one of those realities are we in. And maybe we then go to Christoph for a sort of mid to longer term view on which one of those realities are we in. Mike, a month since we've had you on the show. A month ago, oil prices were knocking their head around 110. A month later, it seems we've been through multiple traumas and we're still knocking our head around 110. What's your thoughts and outlook this early in May?
Yes, thanks, Sean. I'm glad to hear you getting some tennis action there in Spain. Brilliant, with the two top seeds being beaten by the Spanish kid. So great. 3 or 4 things happened in recent days which have shaped the market to go back above $110 pretty decisively so. One was the EU trying to get some consensus amongst the 27 states for which they require unanimity around shedding the need for any Russian oil at all whatsoever. And checking with various sources around Europe, there does seem to be resolved to do so. Obviously, some resistance from some of the landlocked states still, but that was a little bit more decisive than many expected. I guess whilst China is still grappling with its zero COVID policy and reinforcing that is the policy, it hasn't gotten worse. So those who feared that the pandemic would win and China would struggle haven't had their way, if you like. Obviously, terrible situation for citizens of Shanghai. Entire parts of Beijing being told to stay and work from home as well. But it hasn't spiraled, it hasn't snowballed into something really, really dramatic. And therefore people have not worsened their demand loss projections from China for that. And then the news, the two headlines which couldn't have been more comically close to one another, of Fatih Birol saying IEA can release more oil than currently announced if necessary, and then Jennifer Granholm on behalf of the Biden administration stating that they were going to replenish 60 million barrels of US oil to put back a third of the 180 or so which they've pledged so far. So those were all kind of supportive. And meanwhile, the reality on the ground is that we have a view that there is increasing backing in of supplies from Russia, because we're now virtually on top of that date where the international banking system just cannot make payments to Russian entities work. EU sanctions, for example, prohibit a whole number of things from May 15th. And even those parties who have hitherto said that they have existing contractual obligations to fulfill, which would be in breach of law if they didn't take or pay terms or what have you, that is now a different reality. And it manifests itself, of course, in those economies which have the least purchasing power, which are seeing shortages. And those scenes, some of which have been put in your digest, for example, the Sri Lankan government coming under heavy internal criticism for not keeping petrol stations wet is one of many such manifestations.
Let's welcome our Sunday morning regular Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar, a Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christoph, last week in review, we had 2 big moves. Obviously, the 50 basis point by the Fed. We also had the jobs number out of the US at the end of the week. Which one of the two do we look at? That fact that the US economy is facing a very dramatic potential slowdown, or it's still booming? It does seem like we've got multiple things. Which one you want to look at depending on which way you want to go forward? Your thoughts?
On that one, you just put them in the right order, and then the booming number of the job markets tell you to look at the interest rate setting capacity of the Fed quite hardly. So I think when you ask the medium long-term outlooks, it's clear that we are getting into a territory where the Fed has pivoted and is going to continue to have steep rate rises. And the entire discussion, sort of, at least in my profession among economists, is can they possibly engineer a soft landing where inflation comes down without a recession, or do they have to go through a recession in order to bring inflation down? In a perverse sort of way, the war in the Ukraine and the resilience oil markets showed how us, these threats might help them, because the effect of energy prices on inflation is always strictly temporary. It's always subject to this volatility. The moment energy prices stop rising or decline, it will feed through inflation in a positive way. And this kind of volatility may remove some of the need to raise interest rates, which you would have seen if all the underlying inflationary forces came from the labor market and from the goods market. But to take your previous question, just briefly step back a little. I like to be systematic on these things. And when we start systematically, the current your hotelic room experience of all these different news and the world being an oyster with so many layers starts with the war. And I think on the war front, we are seeing that the Ukrainians are starting to turn the tables in the north of Kharkiv and so on, pushing Russia back, while Russia is not capable of making the advances they certainly had planned, and for a second time. And that, together with the fact that there is nothing sort of conciliatory at all coming out of Moscow, bodes bad for, this points towards further escalation, first of words and then hopefully not of deeds. But we should never forget that this is a war which has the capacity to get out of control with unconventional weapons. And that moment where this may happen and may be seen as a last defense and a last stand comes closer and not further away. So we're moving a little away from the scenario of a frozen conflict, more towards one where Ukraine actually continues to push Russian forces back. And on the global setup, I think that it becomes clear that inflation has not retreated, not in Europe, not in the UK, not in the US, and that therefore there's a huge gap which has to be bridged by central banks by way of interest increases if they want to fight it. And it's also clear that we have record indebtedness in the global economy, in the private sector, in the public sector, and in the financial sector. And these interest rate increases will be poison for that. So the recession risk has also increased, while people are sort of dancing on the volcano and spending the leftovers of the easy monetary policy of the last 2 years, which is what you saw in Madrid. And on energy markets, we can discuss separately, I think, but let's just leave it there. That I think, contrary to all the bulls, it's amazing what has to happen when oil is still sort of in the 110 range. It just indicates that there is no shortage of that stuff.
Mike, just to drill down a little bit into your China comments, still sounding bullish there about the outlook for China. It seems slightly contrarian to a lot of the headlines that are still, I mean, I was interesting. I was stick with my analogy of my little trip to Europe, coming back into Dubai airport last night. There was this strange mix of COVID realities. We had a lot of people with masks just dripping around their chins and flip-flops. And then you had Chinese, or it seemed Asian, in full hazmat suits, shields, face masks, coming from a very, very different reality. Your thoughts there on where China's outlook is, the inevitable acknowledgement that they're getting, and at least even by their own news organizations, that it is a difficult period, but yet you don't seem to be indicating that there will be a big hit on their oil consumption. Just your thoughts on that more specifically.
No, there has clearly been a hit on the oil consumption in the transportation sector. There's no question about it. The Chinese tourist is virtually totally absent. Yes, I've been lucky enough to travel as well, and yes, the teams in full hazmat suits, I guess, Chinese delegations, sports teams, what have you, who will then face 3 weeks quarantine on their return. They're few and far between. The vast majority of Asians with face masks on will be Malaysian, Singaporean honeymooners, and people from other ASEAN countries, and obviously a smattering of Korean and Japanese. And therefore, that demand for the Chinese tourist, and more importantly, the Chinese business traveler, is just completely absent. I've got staff who are Beijing and Shanghai based, and it's a major undertaking for them to come on a business trip to Singapore. It's not just a question of 3 weeks in quarantine on return, and then a bit of a question mark over whether that will be extended, courtesy of the Chinese administration, the provincial governments and the state government, but also whether they can actually get a slot to fly back, because there's a finite quota of seats also. So yes, we're clearly missing that segment, and it got, whilst the Chinese domestic aviation sector had recovered, that one's virtually wiped out as well. Flights out of Hong Kong, for example, were down 88% in a statistic last week on on pre-COVID numbers, which is telling you something. The comment I was making was that had you scrolled the clock back a week and taken a poll of experts, I think many would have predicted that we'd see more COVID cases. So China, not surprisingly, given the drastic steps they've taken, have managed to stem the spread of a virus that many think is inevitably going to take hold and run its course across everywhere in the world, regardless how much people try to lock things down. But so far, so good. And of course, as we all know, China reinforced its commitment to the policy. You had a rather interesting headline up on your digest, which is, by the way, being removed from the internet, from what I can see, on Chinese villagers in some remote rural location getting out the sticks and chasing away the enforcers from the provincial government. I mean, that's a nice little story, but maybe just illustrates the view that there should be some sort of public discontent. All of my staff in China are accepting of the policies. They understand the hardship. They observe and feed back to me that there are things like, it's tough to get hold of any food you wish. Delivery service, of course, is the only option. And prices have gone spiraling through the roof on the cost of acquiring certain staple foods, things like, dried noodles and instant noodle packs and that sort of stuff. But on the whole, everyone is being compliant and accepting of things. And the way that the economy is being kept running in certain parts is, companies have made provision for their staff to spend time at the workplace, and that means overnighting. And therefore, the companies are providing the food and the bedding and the creature comforts that are required, so people are literally able to keep making cars or keep making manufactured goods or running the financial sector of Shanghai.
Christoph, you had a very interesting report out in the recent days on this idea of the mandated sanctions versus unilateral sanctions that we have seen before. I'm wondering, when you look at even now with the Europeans looking to move to oil sanctions, or at least on the journey towards it, it still feels like it's like Swiss cheese. There's a lot of holes in it, and the expectation, as we had early in the Ukraine conflict, of a big disruption of Russian oil hasn't really happened yet. Is that still much more likely now? What is your thoughts on this combination of mandated sanctions versus unilateral sanctions?
Well, we have to look back a little bit of what has happened so far in the last 2 months. There's actually only 2 countries in the world which have formally sanctioned and imposed a moratorium against importing Russian energy. And that's the US and Canada, which don't obviously find this too difficult to do. Everything else is either a real consequence on the ground, as in the backup of Russian oil, which nobody wants to touch, but a consequence of financial sector sanctions, no banks, no insurance, no correspondent banks to talk to. Or it is just talk, as in England saying we don't need the oil, we don't need the gas, but we need the oil, and Germany saying we don't need the gas, but the oil, but we need the gas, and it's not binding yet. And the background is that everything we have seen in terms of these unilateral announcements is completely voluntary. Is completely decentralized. So countries go and unilaterally say we can scale down the import of Russian coal, or we will scale down the import of Russian oil down the road. In previous regimes, that was the previous sanction regimes, this was the opposite. Against Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, it was always a centrally announced sanctioning mechanism, mostly the US saying no more Iranian oil, and then very heavy enforcement. So if you would touch Iranian oil, being a trader in Singapore, or being a Chinese bank, or being even a European institution set up for this purpose, you would see secondary sanctions slapped against you, and you would not be able to trade with the US anymore. And the question is, in this situation where Russia is such a big energy provider, so I give you a nice number which I dug out. If you look at this in terms of economic warfare, it would be fair to say that this is a duel between 2 giants, between the G7, representing more than 30% of global GDP, and Russia, representing more than 11% of global energy production. So really 2 big beasts going around there. And if you now look at energy sanctions, the risk is, of course, that they backfire, that you sanction Russian oil and then oil prices go through the roof, and then the economies of the sanctioned countries suffer and have a recession and all of that.
Isn't that more or less what's happening?
That's where the ship seems to be going, but I don't think it will happen. But the question is this, which I asked in the paper: what's better, in order to maximize the economic damage on Russia while minimizing the economic damage to the sanctioning countries. Continuation of the decentralized country by country unilateral decision making. Every country does what it thinks it can afford, or introduction of a centralized mechanism with secondary sanctions and enforcement, which is what the US seems to favor, which is putting the EU now in an interesting position because the EU is a little bit of both. So they want to have a centralized mechanism. They want to have all countries acting in unison, but that would drive them towards a common denominator, which is just not effectual. It's just too little. And so the hope of that paper and that debate is that we can shift a little forward, allowing the EU more flexibility so that they can give some leeway to countries who want to do more to actually do more. Right? Why do the European Union always insist on everybody doing the same in energy? Two reasons. Legally, because they wanted to be in a trade negotiations with the WTO as one block. Makes sense, but you can revoke it. And economically, because they say we're having no border. So if Belgium says no Russian coal and can't order around its commercial companies to do that, then somebody else will just import it. But of course, you can control that in an emergency situation such as this. So the question is, should they move like they always did on the lowest common denominator, or should they be allowed more flexibility? I think the latter is being called for.
Mike, your thoughts on that? Obviously, Vitol, one of the many companies in your peer group and in the upstream that have announced withdrawal from Russia. But yet Russian oil continues to get to the market. Your outlook for that to continue, despite the fact that many international companies are backing away, that Russian oil will continue to reach a destination, and that scale of 3 million barrels disruption that the IEA announced 2 or 3 months ago will indeed not happen. Your thoughts on the scale of the outlook for Russian disruption?
Yes, we're just looking at some numbers here. I mean, before the Ukraine invasion, Russia was producing at or above its quota, which is now 10.66 million barrels per day. And it was putting into its refining system something in the order of 5.7 million barrels per day. The market consensus would seem to be that both those numbers are down about 1 million barrels per day from there, which is, it's not insignificant, but it's a relative drop in the ocean compared to the intended impact of sanctions on Russia. If you add together what that means for net exports, historically Russia was exporting a mix of roughly 2/3 crude, 1/3 products, totaling 7.7 million barrels a day. If only 1 million barrels a day of that has gone missing so far, before the EU shut the door on Russian crude, if they indeed succeed in getting unanimity over that, that is indeed not the intended consequence of the sanctions. If you go across the world, not many countries in Asia, I think close to 0 countries in Africa, not many in Latin America have actually formally got sanctions against Russia. Many pieces of the world economy are sitting on the fence. And notably, the 2 biggest countries, population-wise in the world, are continuing to find ways of accessing Russian oil, India and China. But other
significant discounts.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, the protagonists in those trades are changing because it is not convenient to do what you would normally do if you want to ship Russian oil from the Baltic ports to Asia. You would normally put one of the biggest possible ship to get the best economies of scale. But the process of involving multiple ship owners and the associated insurance that needs to go with that and the payment mechanisms is likely to end up in delays and bottlenecks. And therefore, you're finding that an entire segment of the shipping market will need to be dedicated to this trade, and there are many words for it, but it's clearly not mainstream. And the oil trades at a discount, and the ships will trade at a premium because the ship owner that is engaging in this business may not find that his ships are going to be accepted by everybody else for some time to come. So this is a segment of trade which, of course, might be associated with the flows of oil from other sanctioned countries that have found their way into the Malaysian Straits and then onwards into Chinese markets over the years, with administrations that would be expected to impose sanctions turning a blind eye, if you like, or just not having the wherewithal to intervene. And there is a concern, of course, that this is going to become rather prominent. It's no surprise, perhaps, that India's been invited to join the G7 by Germany to attend those talks and be lent upon pretty hard, because for now, Indian refiners do seem to have the go-ahead from Delhi to continue buying arbitrage barrels, as one large Indian refiner referred to them.
John,
sorry, go ahead, Crystal.
Can I just
Please.
to sharpen that a little bit? When you have sanctions against a big beast like Russia, then you get sort of a double price effect. To the extent that you remove oil from the market, the global price, Brent WTI, goes up. To the extent that that Russian oil is actually, the demand for it falls, and it is floating around, it falls. And that's what we're observing. We see this discount opening. What you want as successful sanctions is to keep that discount as large as possible while you drive down the volumes, the export volumes of Russian oil, of euros. And that's where we are at the moment. If you stop now doing sanctions, the discount will disappear, because markets and people like Mike are very good at finding workarounds and finding new payment ways and all of that. It's only the effect of financial sectors after all. And so you have to keep the pressure on. If you keep the pressure on, you get two effects. It takes time to redirect, as Mike says, all this oil to India and China, and that will keep the discount alive. It will, force Russia to sell it cheaper. And the other effect is that as you build up a backlog, it will damage the Russian production capacity, because Russia is not Saudi Arabia. It's not like scaling up and down big million barrels a day wells. It has a multiple of thousands of little wells, producing 10,000 of little wells in their fields producing this oil. And if they get clogged, as we know from the discussion in 2020, it will be very time-consuming and expensive to bring them back. And in order for that to happen, Europe has to shut off its oil imports, even if it's just a redirection to oil from elsewhere, from the Middle East, from Asia. So just to keep the pressure on the system alive, because this is economic systems. You leave it alone, it's resettles at a new equilibrium, and the pressure is gone, and everything goes on as normal. So that's the background why this matters, why this has to happen anyway.
Let's go to the survey question, which is just to take a little bit of an outlook forward. What phase of economic slowdown / I even use the word collapse are we in? Is it we asked this question 2 years ago at the beginning of COVID, beginning of the end or the end of the beginning? There's a lot of criticism last week on the Fed chairman for taking 75 basis points off of the table, which gave a big spike to equity markets and then a big collapse. So ultimately, the slamming on of the brakes of tackling inflation, triggering a great recession or not. So welcome the thoughts of the outlook for economic growth, which has obviously been revised down a number of times so far this year. Is this the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning? Heard mixed thoughts of that in terms of certainly the equity markets. Mike, your thoughts, outlook going forward. At some point, the oil price and the markets seem to be supported quite significantly by turmoil and uncertainty with Russia and Ukraine, less by economic growth and outlook of positive demand. Your thoughts on that and that changing, that this economic outlook will, to the second half of the year, put a downward pressure on demand and prices?
Yes, I mean, just going back to what we observe, I mean, outside of China, the consumer wishes to spend and resume normal life. And as the masks come off around the world, even with relaxed terms across parts of Asia now, it's virtually impossible to get a flight, whether for holiday destination or for business travel. I mean, I'm waitlisted on 3 flights for the remainder of this month because there's no business class seat available. So for flying in economy potentially. I think there's one thing pertaining to Russia before I come back to your question, which needs to be highlighted also, and that is the speed with which the Germans have fast-tracked 2 and likely 4 regasification facilities to wean themselves off dependence on Russian gas and have the alternative to bring in marginal LNG from Qatar or the US or whatever it might be. And that itself, that's a result in the speed with which they've deployed, with one of their providers, Hook, assuring the Germans that they can have 2 of these units operational by the end of this year, which is phenomenally quick. That has served to lift gas prices in the US sentiment-wise. And of course, the rig counts in the US are up quite substantially, but Henry Hub trading at above $8 per MMBTU is quite something. And of course, I can't end this call without commenting on the fact that US gasoline prices as a nationwide average in the US are hitting $4.30 a gallon, which is close to record ever levels, with a friend telling me that he saw a pump price on a highway in Southern California at $7.30. Now, California is unique, of course. And we have to remind ourselves diesel is above that. And the reality is that there are very, very tight fundamentals in middle distillates. Diesel is not a commodity that's easy to come by, and there's very little space in the supply system for delays arising from cargoes running late, which typically happens when you have backwardation and inventories 35 million barrels below normal levels, and off-spec cargo situations also. So the system is pretty tight as far as oil is concerned. Maybe I'll ask Christoph to to answer the more macroeconomic side of the question.
We had only, it's only 2 months ago, Christoph, that the Fed stopped its easing and buying assets, and now are moving very aggressively into tightening. I'm not hearing from either of you the idea that there could be demand destruction or the economic outlook being somewhat concerning. Your thoughts?
No. I think the economic outlook is very concerning because it has only 2 months ago that the markets were flooded with money, and before that they have been flooded basically since 2008. So it's not up, unfortunately, to the consumer whether he wishes to have a peaceful holiday and all that. There are sometimes forces at work which first create inflation and then could create a recession by the need to pull the brakes. There's one event which we haven't mentioned, which goes back to the China discussion, which may be a little bit of a game changer before the end of this year. This is that I would still expect, given the severity of the COVID-induced slowdown in China and the coincidence with all the problems they have in the housing and financial sector, I would still expect for them to go for a very large fiscal monetary stimulus before the Communist Party Congress in October. Or October, November, the date is secret. And that could provide an impetus for resumed demand, fix some of these bottlenecks, and would be important for energy markets because it would have to be centered much more than in the past on boosting consumption of the population in China rather than infrastructure. So that's the one ray which is a bonus. Everything else looks actually pretty much posed towards either a return to growth rates which were below the pandemic, so not globally 1.5, but maybe 1, and or something worse. But in this big picture of things, will the economy return to pre-pandemic growth? I think it's consensus now that it will not.
Let's get the survey result and give Mike the last word this morning. Beginning of the end rather than the end of the beginning, it seems to be slightly the consensus here. Mike, I welcome your thoughts on, we're coming out of a 2-year period in which OPEC Plus was the engine of oil market stability and the upward motion of the price. Obviously, pre-Ukraine, it was the determining factor to a great extent, the control of OPEC Plus supply and then the return of it. Your outlook for OPEC Plus at this point, what is their role in the market right now? They had a meeting last week. It seemed to be relatively irrelevant. Their current agreement expires in September, which is, of course, just around the corner. How do you look to OPEC Plus now and over the coming months of this year and its relevance for the market?
Yeah, most of OPEC Plus is maxed out. And again, one of the articles in your digest highlighted quite nicely that Nigeria has a quota of 1.7 something and is only outputting 1.4. Angola has a quota of 1.4 and the output is running at 1.1 or thereabouts. And these are largely assets that are operated by foreign companies in country. And these very foreign companies, of course, these super majors have been deploying their very, very depleted capital over the last 2 years on other things. So this is the issue. One of our attendees here tends to be putting up the corporate results for Shell, for example. It has been a reporting season, and I mean, I think it's grossly unfair for the market to be critical of these results. They are a consequence of prices, both in terms of flat price for the upstream, but more importantly, in terms of the margins available in the products sphere and very, very nice refining margins. And the oil majors or energy giants, as should we call them now, are fulfilling their promises to return money to shareholders by engaging in share buybacks. But those can now accelerate, and they're going to face the choice of deploying some of that P&L into resuming the spend, which has been woefully lacking in upstream production, or accelerating the turn away from fossil fuels into renewable greenhouse gas addressing issues, energy transition. And my sense is a lot of the money is going to go into that direction to accelerate that deployment, and it therefore leaves in the hands of others namely national oil companies and private equity, the burden of restoring the investment, not just in US shale, but in some of the more challenging provinces. Because while some of those companies I mentioned would find it unacceptable to say that peak oil is still ahead of us, I think the vast consensus amongst consultants and people that can afford to say so is that we're still seeing oil demand grow, despite the hiatus in China. And that there's a huge question mark over who's going to invest in the marginal oil field, given that underlying decline is a pretty dramatic number if you don't invest in oil fields, and indeed the marginal refining capacity. And look at what a tight shipping market we have now as well, in order to satisfy peak demand, which is, in the opinion of those that can say so, still ahead of us. Yeah. So a lot of concern there. But in the eyes of OPEC Plus, they will continue as set out, adding 400-something thousand barrels per day per month to the market until the end of the agreement. But in reality, it's only those 2 or 3 countries that can still produce the extra. Saudi, the Emirates, and Kuwait, I guess. And Iraq has its own challenges in terms of meeting their phenomenal potential for production for technical reasons. Yeah.
Well, I'll just wrap on that point. Does the market, are market actors looking to OPEC Plus to continue to find consensus beyond September? Is it relevant? Is ultimately my question.
Unless we see massive demand destruction from a recession, sorry, Christoph, I'll be quick, or high prices destroying demand in places which don't have the purchasing power, the spare supply cushion from OPEC will be at a point which is alarming. And it goes hand in hand then with a lower amount of strategic petroleum reserve in the SPR holding countries. So naturally, markets do what they do. They price in the fact that has to be replenished, or that there is the risk of an event as yet unforeseen, causing major shortages and rationing. So, of course, that's why there's upward bias in the price. Sorry, Christoph.
Yes, Christoph, last word to you now on that point. You wanted to jump in?
Well, what we will see, I mean, I disagree with Mike on that one. There is still spare capacity to be had. And what we will see is the Americans leaning on the Gulf countries to do 2 things: to bring it to market and to deal with Russia. And a lot in that numbers game, when you look at the relative size of numbers, again, brings us back to what will happen to Russian supplies. That has the ability to tilt the market. But if there are safety valves in the system, then there are A, in the SPR, B, in those OPEC countries which are subject to sanctions, like Iran and to some extent Venezuela. And then I add to that Libya and Nigeria, the civil war countries where you could achieve something by bringing peace. C, in the core members of OPEC Plus on the Gulf. And finally, in the US, with Biden sort of having to change his schizophrenic policies and come out in the open supporting the shale industry to ratchet up supplies. Those are the 4 prime sources out of the normal response to higher prices, which we would expect.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I think the coming week will certainly provide some further guidance as to where the US economy is going on inflation, with some data points to be reported as to how hard the Fed need to slam on the brakes here, and then the consequences of that, I think, is the story at the moment, and we'll have to see where it goes. Christoph, wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us from London. Mike, good morning. Thanks for being with us again here in May. We look forward to seeing where the world's at in a month's time. Until then, have safe travels. I hope you get bumped up on those waiting lists and all of those travels are comfortable, and hopefully see you passing through Dubai sometime soon. All the best. Have a good week, everybody.
Thanks, John.